The wheat field behind the north fence had gone the color of old gold in the October light, miles of it still, quiet. The kind of quiet a man builds around himself when he has decided the world has nothing left to offer him. Then she was on the porch. He stopped walking, hands still dirty from the field. She had her back to him, dark coat, worn thin, gripping the front of it like it was the last thing holding her together. She wasn't knocking anymore, just standing, like she'd already lost the argument with herself on the long walk out here, and still came anyway. She turned, her eyes were red, her jaw was set, and in her voice, barely above a whisper, 4 words that would take everything he had built in 8 years of silence and break it open from the inside. He didn't know that yet. He only knew she was Earl Reed's daughter, and Earl Reed had never asked him for anything, until now. The wheat field had gone gold, not the soft gold of early season, the deep, stubborn gold of October refusing to let go, miles of it behind the north fence, still, quiet. The kind of quiet a man could convince himself would last forever if he worked at it long enough. Dion Harper had been working at it for 8 years. He came around the corner of the barn that afternoon, with dirt past his wrists and his shirt damp from 4 hours in the field. Wasn't thinking about much, whether he'd left the back gate latched, what he had in the refrigerator worth calling dinner. The usual inventory of a man whose days had settled into a shape he no longer questioned. Then he saw her on the porch. He stopped walking. She had her back to him. Dark coat, older style, washed so many times it had lost its original shape but kept its warmth. Hair pulled back low at her neck. Boots that had walked a long way on dry red dirt. She wasn't knocking, wasn't waiting with any particular patience, just standing there. Like she'd already had the argument with herself on the 3-mile walk out here. Like she'd lost. Like she'd shown up anyway. Dion stood at the bottom of the steps. He didn't say anything yet. She turned. Arlene Reed, 32 years old. Earl Reed's daughter. He had seen her maybe a dozen times across as many years. At the feed store. At the Saturday market. At Earl's funeral 6 months ago, where he had stood near the back because he always stood near the back, and she had been surrounded by people the entire morning. And there are only so many ways to say I'm sorry to someone standing inside that kind of grief. He hadn't said anything to her that day either. Now she was on his porch. Eyes red, not fresh crying red, but the kind that comes from hours of holding yourself together so long the effort leaves marks even after the tears stop. Both hands gripping the front of her coat. Like it was the last thing keeping her upright, he kept his voice quiet. Arlene, what's wrong? She looked at him for a long moment. The look of someone who rehearsed this conversation 100 times on the walk over and now can't locate a single word of it. Her mouth opened, closed. She dropped her eyes to the porch boards. Then she said it. My father told me you needed a wife, barely above a whisper. Like something she'd been carrying a long distance and was finally setting down. Dion didn't laugh, didn't ask her to repeat it. Didn't do any of the reasonable things a reasonable man might reasonably do when a woman appears on his porch after 6 months of near silence, and says something that makes no obvious sense on its surface, because the second he heard it, he understood more than she probably meant to say. He stepped up onto the first stair. The farm sat at the northern edge of Caldwell County, Georgia, where the county road turned to red dirt and the mailboxes started getting fewer and farther between. Wheat field running north along the back fence. 2 rows of vegetable beds along the east side. A chicken coop that leaned slightly to the left and had been leaning slightly to the left for 3 years and seemed fully committed to the lean. 2 dairy cows in the paddock with no names, because naming livestock creates complications a solo farmer doesn't need. An old red barn with a roof that held most of the time, and the house. 2 stories, wood-framed, built by his father's hands on his grandfather's land. Good bones. Plumbing that required negotiation. His mother had kept it full of light and the smell of something always cooking on the back burner. After she died of fever when Dion was 24, he kept it full of quiet and coffee left on the heat too long. Different kind of full. But a man adjusts to the shape of what he has. The scar ran from his left cheek down toward his collarbone. A pale ridge that never tanned the way the rest of him did. It arrived 10 years ago in the tractor accident that should have killed him, and instead rearranged his face and consumed 14 months of his life in recovery rooms and follow-up appointments. Before the accident, he drove into town twice a week, sat at the diner counter on Route 9, bought coffee that wasn't as good as his but came with conversation, which is worth paying extra for when you're 24 and still believe the world is fundamentally on your side. After the accident, he learned something about people he hadn't known before. They weren't unfriendly, exactly. They just had a limited capacity for discomfort. Children stared and hid behind their mothers, because children are at least honest about being scared. Women looked and then adjusted their expressions into something careful. Men clapped him on the shoulder with that particular grip, the one that performs concern while actually performing relief. That grip said glad it wasn't me every single time, without variation, so he stopped going into town as much. The earth didn't do that. Crops didn't care what he looked like. You worked the soil right. It gave you something back. Fair trade. Honest exchange. He had learned to prefer relationships built on that principle. Earl Reed had been the exception to most things. Earl was 63 years old and in good health until he wasn't, which is the nature of heart trouble. It concealed itself behind ordinary days, and then it didn't. Gone in a week. 3 days in the hospital, and then Caldwell County moved through its routines with that stunned expression that means a community has lost someone it doesn't know how to replace. 10 years ago, a 26-year-old with a scarred face and not enough capital and no plan beyond stubbornness had been failing his second growing season. Earl Reed showed up one Tuesday morning with fence post knowledge nobody had asked for and soil pH information that rescued the crops. He didn't make anything of it. He knew something useful and he shared it. That was the whole transaction. A form of generosity that requires nothing from the person receiving it, which is the only kind that never makes anyone feel smaller. When the bank started asking hard questions, Earl walked in and told 3 men in good suits that Dion Harper was worth a second chance. Had known him 6 months, didn't owe him a thing, did it because he had decided Dion was a person, and he acted on that decision accordingly. That was the kind of man Earl Reed was. And 3 months before he died, when he was already failing, when Dion had offered to drive to his place so he wouldn't have to make the trip and Earl wouldn't hear it, he drove himself out in that old green truck, sat down in the chair under the big sycamore at the edge of the yard. The leaves had been going yellow. The October air had that edge to it. Earl looked out at the field for a while without saying anything. Then he said what he came to say, "Dion, my girl Arlene is just like her mother, proud enough to starve before she'll take charity. When I'm gone, if she's in trouble, she won't ask anyone for help. But you know what it costs a person to need someone to believe in them. You know that from the inside." He paused. "Look after the girl, even if she won't let you." Dion had sat with those words for 6 months. Now Earl's daughter was standing on his porch, telling him what her father had said. Not knowing Earl had already been here. Not knowing this conversation had been planned from the moment that old green truck turned up the driveway, he stepped up onto the first stair. Not close enough to crowd her. Just close enough so this felt like a conversation between 2 people instead of a call across a distance. He met her eyes. He was right. Her head came up fast. Those dark eyes went wide with something that hadn't found its shape yet. Shock. And behind the shock, something that could go either way depending on what came next. She had prepared herself for polite rejection, for the kind of gentle dismissal that leaves a person with nothing real to stand on. She had not prepared herself for calm agreement. No, her voice cracked at the edges. "No, you don't understand. I have nothing to offer. I just lost my job. My landlord says I have to be out by the end of the week. I don't have money for another room. I don't have any family left." She stopped, swallowed hard. "If I come here, I'll only be a burden." That word. The way she said it told Dion everything about how many times she'd turned it over on the 3-mile walk out here. 3 miles on red dirt is a long time to argue with yourself. Long enough to talk yourself out of almost anything. She'd made it all the way to the porch anyway. Desperate enough or brave enough, and either way, she was here. Jaw set, eyes afraid. Whatever remained of her pride being used as the last structural support. Her eyes dropped to her worn shoes when she said the word burden, that downward movement. That was the thing that moved Dion from considering to decided. He said her name quietly. Just her name. She went still. "Your father was the best man I ever met in this county." His voice went rough somewhere in the middle of that sentence. He let it. 10 years ago I showed up here with nothing and no real plan. He taught me how to read the weather coming off the ridge, how to fix a pump when the replacement parts cost more than I had, how to look at soil in February and know what it would need by planting time. A pause. When the accident nearly took everything from me, he walked into the bank and told them I wasn't a failure. Said I was someone who needed more time and deserved the chance to prove it. Arlen's lips were trembling. He kept going. Before he died, he drove out here in that old green truck. He was already weak. I offered to go to him. He wouldn't hear it. Dion glanced toward the empty chair under the sycamore. The leaves had gone yellow and dry, and they moved in the October wind with a sound like turning pages. He sat in that chair and said, "Something I've been carrying for 6 months." She waited. Completely still, he said your pride was going to be the hardest thing to work around. That you'd show up with nothing and call it a burden when it wasn't. And he asked me to look after you, because he understood you wouldn't ask anyone yourself. The tears came then, all at once. She covered her mouth with one hand. The sound behind it was small and broken and had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with a daughter who had just learned what her father had done quietly on her behalf while he was already running out of time. I didn't know. Her hand dropped. He told me he was going to visit an old friend. I didn't know he came here for that. He didn't want you to know. He understood you'd fight it. She wiped her face fast. Back of her hand, angry at herself for the tears, pulled her shoulders straight. Did the thing people do when assembling themselves back together in front of another person, which is always harder than doing it alone. But if I stay here, not quite a question. She already knew part of the answer. What will people say? They talk enough already. A pause. Mrs. Veal fired me and told everyone I stole a silver bracelet from her bedroom. I didn't, Dion. I swear I didn't take anything from that woman. She looked directly at him when she said it. Not a flicker of evasion. Not the careful stillness of someone managing their words. Just direct and flat and furious and afraid all at once. The expression of someone who leads with the denial because the accusation is always already in the room before they enter it. Dion said it without hesitation. I believe you. She stopped completely. Those 3 words landed somewhere she wasn't ready to be hit. Something loosened in her face that had been held rigid for a long time. She had not heard those words in that order recently, and receiving them now from someone she hadn't asked landed with a weight she clearly hadn't anticipated. This isn't charity. He moved on before she could retreat into the argument she'd prepared on the long walk out here. The farm is more than one person can manage well. The vegetable beds produce more than I can sell before things go bad. The house needs looking after. The paperwork for the county agricultural program. The weekend market logistics. The online orders I've been trying to build for 2 years without enough hours to do it right. I cannot keep up with all of it and also keep up with the actual farming. He held her eyes. You need a place to live. I need reliable help. We make a fair arrangement. Both sides get something real. Neither party owes the other a favor. Arlene studied him. The weariness of someone who has been offered things that turned out to be different than advertised. What kind of arrangement? We get married. Civil ceremony. Courthouse. Nothing elaborate. You'll have the legal right to stay here. Insurance coverage if you ever need it. A place nobody can take from you on 3 days' notice. He kept his voice even. Walking her through a contract, which he was. In return, you help with the house, the garden, the weekend market, the paperwork. You'll have your own room and your own life. Nothing beyond what either of us freely chooses. She was quiet for a long stretch. Her eyes moved across the wooden house behind him, across the gold field beyond it. Then they came back to his face, to the scar, the way eyes always came to the scar, not a choice, not a flaw in character, just the thing that happens. But what Dion had learned to watch for was always what came after the landing. Disgust, pity, or plain human assessment. He had become accurate at reading all 3. Arlene's eyes held none of the first 2, only exhaustion and careful measuring and something small she looked genuinely afraid to name even to herself. What do you get out of this? Barely a voice. Dion gave her a small, tired smile. Maybe a house that doesn't feel quite so quiet. The words came out simpler than he'd intended, more honest than he'd planned. He had been going to say something practical, said something true instead. And there it sat between them on the porch boards, small and real, and apparently capable of making her eyes fill again without warning. From somewhere towards the center of Caldwell, the old church bell on the square marked 6 o'clock. She stood in the fading October light, between one life and another, between everything that had been unraveling for months and whatever this might become. At last she drew a breath, lifted her chin. Eyes still afraid. Monday, he said. Courthouse opens at 9. We keep it simple, no ceremony, no guests, no noise. She nodded slowly. Monday, then he stepped up the last 2 stairs and reached past her to open the front door, held it open. Because whatever she decided tomorrow or Sunday or first thing Monday morning, she was not walking back to town in the dark, carrying everything she'd carried out here. Come inside tonight. Whatever you decide. You don't have to make that walk back in the dark. She stood at the threshold for a few seconds, looking at the open door the way a person looks at something they've spent a long time pretending they didn't want. Then she walked through it. The spare room had been his mother's. He hadn't changed much in it across the years of its emptiness. The wooden bed frame, the small dresser with the clouded mirror, the chair by the window facing east over the vegetable beds. In the evenings, when the light came at the right angle, it held a warmth the rest of the house had largely lost. That morning, before Arlene arrived, Dion had put a mason jar of wildflowers on the dresser, picked from the patch along the south fence where they came up every October without anyone tending them. Purple ones. Late goldenrod. Something small and white he didn't know the name of. He felt slightly foolish about it, approximately 30 seconds after setting them down. He didn't move them. That evening, he put together a simple meal. Bread, sliced ham, the last of the canned tomatoes from his own beds. The kind of food that doesn't pretend to be more than it is. They sat at the kitchen table and she told him about the past month in pieces. The way people tell hard things when they haven't yet determined how much they're permitted to say. Constance Veal's accusation had arrived without warning 3 weeks prior. A bracelet, antique silver, from the nightstand drawer in the master bedroom. Arlene had cleaned that room every Thursday for 3 years. Same routine, same thoroughness. Nothing ever disturbed that shouldn't have been. Then a Friday afternoon phone call. Don't come back on Monday. By Saturday morning, half of Caldwell County had already heard Constance's version. The police came to my apartment, Arlene said, hands wrapped around the coffee mug Dion had placed in front of her. They were professional about it. They looked through everything and found nothing, which I could have told them before they walked in. But Constance had already talked. Her version had been going around for 2 full days before the police showed up. A pause. My landlord called the following week. Said he'd heard what was being said around town and needed me to find other arrangements. Said he was sorry. She stopped. He didn't sound sorry. Was there any warning before the accusation? Anything off in the weeks before? Something moved across her face. A brief tightening. She'd been cooler. For maybe a month before it happened. Like I'd done something she was deciding how to respond to. I kept trying to think of what I might have done wrong. I'm always careful in other people's homes. She looked at the table. It didn't matter. Those last 3 words told him the most. The resignation behind them. The sound of someone who has already worked through the injustice of a thing and arrived on the other side in the gray territory of simply dealing with what is, regardless of what should be. They didn't talk much after that. The silence between them wasn't comfortable yet, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people accustomed to being alone, deciding without any formal negotiation whether they could share a room without the aloneness getting louder. When they went upstairs, she stopped in the doorway of her room, one hand on the frame. Her bag was already inside, a single soft-sided suitcase. Wasn't heavy. That said something about the past month without either of them needing to name it. Dion? Yeah, why are you really doing this? Not looking at him. Looking at the floor of the room, not the arrangement version. The real one underneath it. He leaned against the wall across from her door, thought about it honestly before answering. Earl Reed stood in a bank and told 3 men in good suits that I was worth a second chance. He'd known me 6 months, didn't owe me a thing. He did it because he decided I was a person and acted on that decision. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at her. He drove out here 3 months before he died to ask me to look after you, because he knew you wouldn't ask anyone yourself. A pause. I'm doing this because I owe him something I can't repay him directly. And because I don't think you should be forced out of your home, because a woman with more money than conscience decided you were a convenient target. Arlene was quiet. That's more complicated than a simple arrangement. Most things worth doing are. She didn't respond to that. Then she pushed off from the doorframe, stepped back into the room, and just before she closed the door, she looked at him one final time. Good night, Dion. Good night, Arlene. A pause. The smallest pause. her hand already on the inside of the door, then quieter, almost like testing the word's weight before committing to it. "Good night, husband." Uncertain, almost self-conscious, but said aloud, which meant she had decided something, even if she couldn't yet fully name what. The door closed. Dion stood in the dark hallway. The house breathed around him the way old houses do at night, contracting in the October cold, floorboards settling, the walls holding all their layered seasons, and the people who had moved through them. He had been the only person in this house for 8 years, not always unhappy, but always aware of the weight of being the only living thing inside it. That weight was different tonight. Something was in it now that hadn't been there before. He went to his room and lay in the dark and listened to the new quality of the silence, the kind that has something underneath it. Outside, the wheat field held its gold in the dark. The coop leaned its steady lean to the left. The north farm breathed, and for the first time in a long time, so did the man inside it. Monday arrived with a pale, cloudless sky and the sharpness of October deciding to be serious about itself. Dion woke before first light, lay still for a few minutes listening. The door down the hall was closed, no sound from behind it. He shaved carefully. The scar made shaving complicated the way it had always made it complicated. The skin there unpredictable at certain angles, requiring slow attention. Found the white shirt in the back of the closet, still faintly cedar-scented from the trunk his mother had kept winter things in. The dark jeans without grease worked deep into the fiber, polished the boots. None of it amounted to anything formal, but it was the best version of what he had. When he came downstairs, she was already in the front room, standing near the window. Back to him, the dress she wore was dark blue with small white embroidery along the collar. Simple and slightly old-fashioned in a way that felt chosen rather than dated. The kind of dress that belongs exactly where it is. When she turned at the sound of his boots on the floor, he watched her take him in. The clean shirt, the careful shave. Something moved across her expression that she tried to put away before he could read it. Didn't quite manage it. "You look different," she said quietly. "So do you." Her cheeks colored. She smoothed the front of the dress with both hands. "It was my mother's. It's the only good thing I brought with me." "It's enough," he said. He meant it without anything extra attached to it, and yet it seemed to land with more weight than he'd intended. She looked at him for a beat, then looked away. They drove into Caldwell mostly in silence. She kept looking at her hands in her lap. He kept both hands on the wheel and noticed, somewhere in the back of his attention, the way a truck cab he had driven alone for 8 years suddenly felt smaller with another person in the passenger seat. Not uncomfortably so. But noticeably Roy Childs was already waiting on the courthouse steps when they arrived, 68 years old. Silver hair combed flat in a way that required effort. His best Sunday shirt on a Monday morning. Roy had been Dion's nearest neighbor for 7 years, and in 7 years he had never once treated the scar as something requiring either acknowledgement or careful avoidance. He was one of a very small number of people Dion had kept in his life. Partly for that reason, Roy shook Dion's hand firm, then turned to Arlene with a nod that carried genuine warmth. "Your father fixed my old tractor 3 summers running, every time it broke down, free of charge. Said the problem-solving kept his mind occupied and he was glad to do it. A beat. That was a good man. I think he'd be glad you're not facing this alone." Arlene's eyes brightened. She held the tears in place. "Thank you, Mr. Childs." Tamara Booker arrived a few minutes later, slightly out of breath, pulling Arlene into a long, tight hug before she'd even fully stopped moving. "The kind that says I was scared for you and I'm glad you're here." Then she stepped back and studied Dion with the frank assessment of someone who hasn't finished forming her opinion and isn't going to pretend otherwise. He couldn't fault her for it. He was a stranger who had offered shelter to her friend under circumstances that required a generous interpretation of the word reasonable. She drew Arlene aside and spoke quietly. "Not quietly enough. Are you absolutely certain about this?" Not quite a question. A last checkpoint, Arlene looked across the courthouse hallway at Dion. Her answer was soft, but it didn't waver. "I don't know how it ends. But he doesn't look at me like I'm a problem to be managed." Tamara held her eyes for another moment, then gave a small, reluctant nod. The ceremony itself took less than 10 minutes. A county clerk with the efficient, slightly weary manner of someone who has performed this ritual enough times that the words have detached from their meaning. No music, no decorations. A small windowless office that smelled of printer toner and carpet nobody had replaced since the 90s. Roy and Tamra signed in the designated places. For the rings, Dion reached into his jacket pocket and produced his mother's silver band, plain, worn slightly at the inner edge, the way objects get worn when they've been in constant contact with a living person for decades. He held it in his open palm. It was hers. It's the most I have left of her. If you're willing to wear something already worn. Arlene held out her left hand without speaking. Her fingers trembled once, briefly, when he put the ring on. It fit better than it had any logical reason to. The clerk cleared his throat. You may kiss the bride if you wish. Arlene went very still. Dion could see the held breath, the slight tension in her shoulders. He moved slowly, deliberately slowly, giving her every available moment to decide. Because whatever else this was, it was not going to be a moment where he took something she hadn't offered freely. She didn't step back. He pressed his mouth to hers for the space of 1 second. Barely anything, the lightest possible contact. When he straightened, her eyes were wide and dark, and she wore the expression of someone who has just felt something they weren't expecting. He had felt the same thing, and hadn't expected it either. Roy clapped his hands once. The sound filled the small office. Tamra laughed through what had clearly become sudden tears. Congratulations, both of you. Now go home and eat something. On the drive back, Arlene sat with her hands in her lap and turned the ring slowly with her thumb. The way you turn something when you're checking whether it's real. After a while, she looked over at him. Your mother wore this ring 31 years, she said. Did she like farming? She liked my father. The farming came as part of the agreement, a brief pause. She complained about it every spring when it pulled him out of bed before sunrise. Then she'd carry coffee out to the field at 10 in the morning because she couldn't stand being in the house while he was out there. Arlene turned the ring slower. That sounds like a good arrangement, she said. And the word arrangement carried a weight in that sentence that it hadn't carried earlier in the week when they had first applied it to something else entirely. They turned onto the red dirt road running north toward the farm. She looked out at the wheat field coming into view, the gold still holding in the midday light, the red barn behind it, the house with its wooden porch and its slightly uneven roofline. It's bigger than I remembered, too big for one person. He looked at her, not anymore though, she didn't answer. But he saw her hand press flat against her leg, like steadying something that had shifted. Inside, he walked her through the main floor properly, the kitchen with its window over the east beds. The back porch that overlooked the garden rose stretching toward the far fence. The mudroom stacked with things that had never found a more specific category. Then upstairs to her room, she stepped inside and stood still for a moment. Just stood and looked at the space, the wooden bed frame, the chair by the window facing east, the dresser with its clouded mirror, and on top of it the mason jar of wildflowers he had placed there that morning, purple ones from the south fence patch. Late goldenrod, something small and white he had never learned the name of. She stood and looked at them without speaking. Then she turned around and her eyes were wet, but the tears in them looked different from the ones he'd seen on the porch 2 days ago. Those had been pressed down by weeks of accumulated damage. These were lighter, something closer to relief than sorrow. I didn't know what you'd want, Dion said from the doorway. I just thought a room someone's moving into should have something living in it. She said it quietly. Thank you, Dion, not just for the room, she searched for the right words, for making me feel like I'm not something that got left behind. He didn't know what to say to that. So he nodded and went back downstairs to give her the room and the quiet and whatever time she needed to make the space feel like hers. That evening she moved around his stove with the careful attention of someone learning the personality of an unfamiliar instrument. In about 20 minutes she had produced from what he had in the refrigerator something that made his kitchen smell entirely different than it usually did. Eggs with fresh herbs from the window box, toast with honey. The last of the fall tomatoes sliced and arranged as though presentation were worth taking seriously. Coffee made by someone who understood what the result was supposed to taste like. Dion took the first bite and sat quietly long enough that she began to look uncertain. Is something wrong with it? Nothing at all, he said. I'm just taking a moment to reconsider every meal I've made myself in the last several years, which accounts for a significant number of meals. The smile that crossed her face was the real kind. reached all the way into her eyes without any assistance from the will. First time he'd seen that particular version, it did something to the inside of his chest that he chose not to examine closely at that moment. They talked while they ate. She told him her mother died when she was 12. He told her his died of fever when he was 24, 2 years before the tractor accident, which meant he had lost both parents before he was 27, and spent the decade afterward building a version of himself that didn't require anything from anyone. One approach to survival, and a poor approach to living. She nodded when he said that. The nod of someone who recognizes a description from the inside. The silence that followed was a different quality from the earlier silences. Something had been named that people in first conversations don't usually name. The shape of a certain kind of loneliness, identified across a kitchen table by 2 people who had each been living inside it for years, and neither of them looked away from the recognition. When they went upstairs at the end of the evening and stopped in the hall, her door to the left and his to the right, Dion cleared his throat. Your room's on the left, mine's on the right. You can lock the door if it makes you more comfortable. I won't take it as an offense. She rested her hand on the doorknob, looked back at him. Good night, Dion. Good night, Arlene. She paused. A small hesitation, color in her cheeks that hadn't been there a few minutes before. Then, quieter than the first time she'd said it, and steadier. Good night, husband. This time the word came out differently than it had in the hallway 2 nights ago. Less tentative, less like a test being conducted, more like something she'd been turning over and had decided was accurate. She went into her room. The door clicked shut. Dion stood in the dark hallway. The October wind moved the sycamore outside, the distant sound of one of the cows shifting in the paddock, the boards beneath his feet adjusting to the temperature drop of late evening. All the usual sounds the house made, but underneath them something new. The quiet presence of another person's life behind a closed door. The fact that when he came downstairs tomorrow morning, he would not be the only person in the building. He had been the only person in this building for 8 years. He went to his room and lay in the dark and felt the house differently than he had felt it the night before. Not like a place he was simply occupying, like somewhere that had been, without any announcement, chosen. That distinction, small as it sounds when you try to describe it, was everything. Outside, the North Farm held its October quiet. The wheat stood in the field, the coop leaned its reliable lean, the sycamore moved in the dark wind. And in the house at the northern edge of Caldwell County, Georgia, 2 people who had each been alone for too long lay in separate rooms on the same floor and listened to the house breathe. Neither of them fell asleep quickly, neither of them minded. The second week looked different from the first. The first week you manage logistics, where things belong, how to move through a shared kitchen without constant collision, whether the silence at the table carries meaning or carries nothing. The second week, the logistics begin to settle, and what lives underneath them becomes visible. What was underneath was this. Arlene Reed knew things Dion Harper didn't know, and watching her apply that knowledge was doing something to his interior architecture that he hadn't anticipated and hadn't budgeted for. It started with the tomato beds. He came around the corner of the barn on the 3rd morning after the courthouse and found her already out there in the early light. Gray dress, hair pulled back, crouched in the dirt without any apparent concern for the gray dress, her hands working the soil around the base of the nearest plant with the attention of someone who had done this many times and had formed opinions about the correct way to do it. Dion stopped at the edge of the bed. She didn't look up. These need stakes, she said. The fruit weight is pulling the main stems sideways. Another week and you'll have breakage. He looked at the plants. He had been looking at those plants for 6 weeks and had not noticed that. The lettuce on the east end needs to come out now, she continued, moving along the row without standing up, duck walking through the dirt. Leave it 3 more days and it'll be too bitter to sell. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Something in her expression was different out here. Less guarded, more direct. This was ground she trusted. What? She said. I'm wondering why someone who clearly knows what she's doing was cleaning houses for a living. Something shifted in her face. She looked at the middle distance for a moment before she answered. My mother grew everything. We didn't have much money when I was growing up, but we always had food because she made the ground work for us. A pause. After she died, I kept her garden going, My father tried to help, but he had no patience for it, so it fell to me. I liked it. The ground doesn't pretend. You put in the work or you don't. The plants will tell you which. Dion sat down on the edge of the raised bed. No concern for his genes. Earl never mentioned you had a garden. Just containers by the end. In the window of the apartment, she looked at her still dirty hands. You can't grow much in containers, but you can grow something. They stayed there in the morning light, in the dirt between the tomatoes that needed staking and the lettuce heading toward bitter. Two people who had both spent years being useful to a piece of ground and not much else. Sitting in the place where that kind of usefulness made sense, Dion didn't know what to do with that. But he registered it carefully. She had every tomato plant staked by that same afternoon. Drove the bamboo supports into the ground with a precision that came from having done it many times, at the angle she'd decided was correct. The plants stood straight afterward, more orderly than they had been under his management, less like a collection of things growing wherever they happened to decide, more like a garden someone was paying attention to. He asked her that evening what else she needed for the beds. She considered it, more basil. The market variety specifically. People buy it faster than anything else I've seen move at a Saturday stall. A pause. And the pepper plants on the East End need fertilizing. They've been producing slow all season and it's not the water. He ordered the basil seeds that night from the supplier he used. Drove into town the next morning for the fertilizer she specified, and noticed, in the part of his mind he mostly tried not to consult directly, that he had been finding reasons to walk past the vegetable beds approximately 4 times more often than his actual farm work required. He told himself this was because the garden represented a developing operational situation that warranted monitoring. He was lying to himself. But it was a sustainable lie, the kind a man can maintain as long as he doesn't turn the full light of his attention directly onto it. The days arranged themselves around work. He was in the wheat field, or mending fences, or managing the 1,000 small mechanical failures that a property of this age generates on a reliable rotating schedule. Arlene ran the house, tended the garden, and spent increasing time at the kitchen table where he'd set up the farm's online ordering platform 2 years earlier and had never fully understood how to use it properly. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the entire interface. Replaced the product listings with new descriptions and photographs she had taken herself in the garden, in good morning light. The number of specialty herb orders for the following month had doubled. He learned about this because a notification appeared on his phone from the platform. Incoming orders requiring confirmation. He came in from the field that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway. Did you update the listings? She didn't look up from the laptop. The photographs you had were taken in poor light. The descriptions weren't accurate. The rosemary was listed simply as fresh herbs, which describes everything in the garden. I specified the variety, the harvest date, and the fact that it's grown without pesticides. Because it is, I didn't ask you to do that. You didn't tell me not to. She looked up then, direct, calm, waiting. If it's overstepping, say so and I'll restore the original listings. It was not overstepping. He confirmed the orders and went back outside and stood in the yard for a minute, thinking about the quality of a person who sees a problem and fixes it, rather than asking permission to address it. Earl Reed had operated exactly that way. Showed up with fence post knowledge nobody had requested and soil pH information that rescued a second growing season. Hadn't made anything of it, simply knew something useful and shared it. His daughter had inherited the approach without apparent effort, and without apparent awareness that it was anything other than ordinary, which, Dion was beginning to understand, was what made it remarkable. The conversation about Constanceville assembled itself across those first 2 weeks in pieces rather than all at once. That is the nature of those conversations. You set down one part when it feels safe to set it down. You pick up the next piece a few days later. Eventually the complete picture is in front of you. Arlene had worked for Constance for 3 years, not because it was the only available work in Caldwell County, but because it paid better than anything else in that category by a margin that mattered. She had been supporting herself since her father's health began failing. The Bills had developed firm opinions about what she could afford to be selective about. 3 years of consistent work, nothing misplaced, nothing damaged, no conflict that wasn't resolved before Constance had cause to notice it, then the bracelet. Dion had known about Constance Veal the way everyone in Caldwell County knew about her, from a careful distance. She had settled in the county approximately 15 years back, with a settlement from a marriage that had produced significant money and significant unhappiness, and she had used that money to insert herself into the local economy in ways that were technically lawful and practically predatory. She bought land from owners at their most vulnerable. She had acquired a minority stake in the county's community bank when the previous shareholders needed liquidity and had nowhere else to turn. She sat on the boards of 3 local organizations and used each position not because she cared about what the organization did, but because proximity to community decisions was useful currency. She had approached Dion about purchasing his property 4 years prior, sent a representative first, came herself when the representative returned without the answer she wanted. The offer was below market value, and the conversation conducted itself from a height. She spoke to him the way a person speaks to someone they expect to be grateful for the attention, which is not a register that brings out Dion's cooperative instincts. He said no twice without ambiguity. Since then, the farm had developed a pattern of low-grade interference from the surrounding community. A store that had bought his specialty produce for 2 consecutive seasons declined to renew without explanation. A rumor, untraceable, never specific enough to confront, about concerns regarding his water source. A slightly different temperature in conversations with his bank loan officer. Not threatening, just cooler. Like the room had dropped 2 degrees without anyone opening a window. None of it individually actionable. Collectively, it described a pattern with a single origin point. He explained this to Arlene one afternoon while she worked the soil around the pepper plants, and he sat on the edge of the raised bed, not worrying about his genes anymore. She made an offer on this property and I turned it down. After that, things around town started going sideways in small, unprovable ways. He watched her face. If she moved to fire you, it was very likely for a reason that had nothing to do with the bracelet. Arlene sat back on her heels. The anger that moved through her expression was controlled. But genuine. She's been doing this to you for years. It's her pattern. She doesn't accept the word no without extracting a cost from the person who said it. A pause. And now she's applying that same pressure to me. Because I'm connected to you, probably. Or she had already decided before you were connected to me and the timing is coincidental. He paused. Either way, the mechanism is the same. Arlene pressed both hands into the soil. A habit he'd noticed. Something she did when she was working through something difficult. Grounding herself in the most literal sense. My father knew her, she said. He didn't like her. He rarely said much about people he didn't like, but when her name came up he'd go quiet in a certain way. She looked up. He thought you were a good man. Told me that once, a few years ago, not in any particular context. Just mentioned it. Said the Harper boy on the North Farm is solid. A pause. That was his highest form of compliment. Dion didn't know what to do with that. He looked at the pepper plants. She looked at his face. Not at the scar specifically. At his face. The way a person looks when they've decided to say something they've been carrying for a while. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Does it still bother you? The scar. The way people's eyes go to it. It bothered me considerably more in the early years. The honest answer, not the comfortable one. There was a period when I avoided mirrors. I understood in my mind that it was just skin, the surface of a thing. But there is a gap between understanding something intellectually and living with the experience of watching someone flinch when they first look at you. That gap closed over time. Most days I don't think about it. And the days you do, I think about Earl, he said. After the accident, he looked at me exactly the way he'd looked at me before it. Not with any visible effort of not looking at the scar. Just as though the scar wasn't the relevant information. As though I was still the relevant information, and the scar was simply something else that was also present. A pause. That is a harder quality to find in a person than it should be. Arlene set down the small trowel she'd been using. She reached up and touched his face, not the undamaged side. The scar. Her fingertips along the ridge of it, slow, without hesitation, without the performance of deliberate courage that sometimes accompanies that kind of contact. Just her hand. Just the fact of it. Someone touching the part of him that most people treated as an obstacle to navigate around, rather than simply a part of a face. Dion went completely still. She held her hand there for a moment. Then let it drop back to her lap. I don't see what they see, she said. Her voice was quiet and carried the full weight of being true. I see a man who came through something hard and is still here, still standing, still doing the work. She held his eyes. That is not an ugly thing. That is not ugly at all. His throat had closed. There was nothing to answer with that wouldn't either diminish the moment or expand it beyond what it was. So he sat in the dirt of the October garden and let the moment be exactly what it was, which was this. He was beginning to understand something he had not been adequately equipped to receive. The Saturday market in Caldwell occupied the 3-block stretch of storefronts on the square that closed to vehicle traffic on weekends. Ran from 7 until noon. Dion had attended this market for 7 years and sold reasonable quantities of produce in a reasonable arrangement and had not thought much about the visual dimension of any of it. Arlene had spent the entire preceding week preparing for their first appearance together. Sorted and harvested with a purposefulness that communicated she understood the market as a presentation as much as a transaction. Rearranged his standard display baskets, added small handwritten cards to each variety with the name and a specific use suggestion. Bundled the herbs so they looked like they came from somewhere that cared about them. First time they went together, 2 weeks after the courthouse, people looked. This was expected. Caldwell is a small town. Small towns notice departures from established patterns. A man who has lived alone for 8 years appearing at the Saturday market with a woman wearing his mother's ring is a departure worth noticing. Dion had prepared himself for the sideways conversations, the way a small community processes new information, which is through everyone knowing before anyone has formally asked. What he hadn't accounted for was the speed at which Constance Veal had been operating. Tamra found them between the stalls 20 minutes into the morning. She had the expression of someone delivering news they've been sitting on and can no longer hold. She pulled Arlene into the space between 2 produce tables, speaking low and fast. Constance has been talking. Tamra's voice was tight, precise. She's telling people you married him because you're carrying a child. That the marriage is a financial arrangement with a costume on it. That you used a vulnerable man's situation to get yourself out of a desperate position. A pause. She's also been using the word seduced. Specifically that you seduced a man who was lonely enough to fall for it. Arlene went pale, then the color came back. But it returned as something different from what had drained away. Not embarrassment. Something harder. Something with edges. How many people has she told this to? Enough? Tamra said. She glanced past Arlene at Dion and appeared to reach some private conclusion. I believe both of you. That's not in question. The question is, she isn't stopping. Constance Veal appeared at the end of their table shortly after. She arrived with the quality of something that has always been on its way. Coat that cost more than a month of farm income. Jewelry catching the light from every angle. The ease of someone who had long since stopped noticing she was the most financially comfortable person in any room she entered. She stopped in front of their table and looked Arlene over. How lovely, sweet and calibrated. You look very much at home here, Arlene. Your father always worked so hard to make you appear to be something more elevated, didn't he? A pause timed for effect. And here you are. Exactly where you were always headed. The stalls nearest to them went quiet in the way of people who are absolutely listening while maintaining the appearance of not listening. Dion kept his jaw loose, voice flat. Morning, Mrs. Veal. Shopping today or just passing through? She turned to him, sharpened smile. Still blunt, Dion. I suppose men in your position don't invest much in social polish. She raised her voice by precisely the increment needed to ensure the neighboring stalls received it clearly. How is married life treating you? Have you had opportunity to think clearly about what you've stepped into? The whole town has a fairly clear picture of why she married you. She needed a roof and you were accessible. I'd hope you didn't sign anything that creates complications for the property. Before Dion could open his mouth, Arlene stepped forward. She took his hand, deliberate, in full view of everyone within range. Her fingers were cold against his, but her grip was solid. She looked at Constance and her voice carried clearly. My marriage is not a subject I'm going to discuss with you. What you're doing right now tells me everything I needed to understand about why you accused me of theft. This is what you do when a situation doesn't resolve the way you want it to. You construct a version of events and you deliver it loudly until the truth gets lost in the volume. She didn't move back, didn't lower her voice by a degree. You should think carefully about what it costs a person to live that way. From the outside, it looks like an expensive habit. Something shifted in Constance's expression. A flicker of something that in a person with different instincts might have been self-recognition. But she had been operating this way long enough that whatever that impulse was, she had learned to convert it. Her voice dropped. Quieter now, more deliberate. You are a penniless orphan who found her way into a desperate man's situation. I made one phone call to your landlord and you were gone in a week. I am capable of undoing every connection you have assembled since then. Arlene's grip on Dion's hand tightened, but she didn't move back an inch. You already tried, each word level and placed. You took my employment. You arranged to put me out of my home. You spread lies about me to people who accepted them because you have resources and I didn't. A beat. And I am still standing here. Constance had a response ready. She always had responses ready. And it came out low and aimed to damage. The truth is you came to his bed before you came to his courthouse. The truth is the ring is a prop, and everyone at this market has already worked that out. The silence that followed had texture. The texture of a community pausing to decide something about itself. Arlene went white. Dion felt the tremor move through her hand into his. He stepped forward. Arlene is my wife before the law and before God. His voice came out slower and harder than he'd calibrated for, which was acceptable. Slow and hard was precisely what the moment needed. She has more integrity than any lie assembled out of spite. Anyone here who wants to say something about my wife can say it directly to me. But I will not stand at this table and watch someone drag her name through a public street to settle a business grievance. Pastor Jerome Odom had been at the far end of the market collecting produce for the church's weekly community meal program. He walked toward them with the unhurried certainty of a man who has spent enough years in the presence of human conflict to understand that speed rarely improves it. He looked at Constance with the disappointment of someone who has moved past anger into something quieter and sadder. Those are serious accusations without any supporting evidence. This community is built on better principles than that. I would ask you to apologize or to go home. Constance looked at the faces around her, at how the morning had arranged itself against her without any single person making a production of it. She spoke quietly. Just to the two of them, this conversation is not finished. Then she turned and walked away. The market around them slowly, collectively exhaled. Arlene stood beside Dion with her hand still in his and the tremor still in it. She was not crying, but it was a near thing. The cost of what she'd just done was written in the way she was holding herself. Spine straight, chin level, the posture of someone who has used the last of something and is standing on the other side of the using. Dion leaned down and kept his voice for her alone. Are you all right? She looked up at him, eyes red at the edges, but they had not broken. No, she said, but I'm not going to let her be the one who decides what I am. 4 days after the market confrontation, Dion saw it coming from the wheat field in the morning. The cloud line sitting on the western horizon was too low and too consistent. He had been reading this sky for 10 years. The atmosphere over this part of Georgia has its own vocabulary, and he had learned most of its grammar. This configuration meant serious weather approximately 8 hours out, the unmanageable kind. He came in at noon and found Arlene at the kitchen table with the farm's laptop. Significant storm coming in from the west. Arrives after dark. I need to secure the barn, cover the stored hay, lock down the tools. He was already pulling on his jacket. Can you get the chickens inside? Close all the ground floor windows and fill the emergency water containers in the mudroom. She was on her feet before he finished. How much time? 6 hours. Possibly less, then stop explaining and go. They worked separately through the afternoon. He moved between the barn and the tool shed and the paddock, where the cows needed to be shifted to the covered section before the ground turned to mud. Arlene worked the house and the chicken yard and the mudroom with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything she did. He could hear her across the yard at intervals, the bang of window latches being secured, the scrape of water containers being dragged across concrete floor to the filling position. The sky went dark well before it should have. By 5 in the afternoon it looked like 8. The wind came up from the west with the purpose of something that has finished warming up and is fully committed. The rain arrived while Dion was still in the barn tightening the tarp across the hay bales. Not gradually. At full strength immediately, the way substantial rain comes in the south. not escalating, simply present, as though the sky had been accumulating everything it had and decided to release it all at once. He was securing the last corner of the tarp when he heard the coupe door go. The wind had found the latch, the one with the worn tolerance he'd been meaning to replace for 6 months. It swung open hard and bounced off the frame with a crack that carried clearly over the rain. He looked through the barn doorway into the yard. 4 chickens already out, moving in the panicked, purposeless circles of birds who have successfully escaped a situation they wanted to escape and now have no plan that extends beyond the escape itself. He dropped the tarp edge and called toward the house. "Arlene, stay inside. I'll get them." But she was already there, rain jacket half on, hood up, moving toward 2 birds near the base of the sycamore. She had one caught against her chest and was trying to corner a second one, which was making committed circles around the tree roots. "Go back inside," he called. Her head came up. Rain loud enough that she had to raise her voice. "I've almost got the second one. Go around the other side of the tree," so they were both in it. He went around the east side of the sycamore to cut off the escape route while she came from the west, with the patient precision of someone who had done this before. The bird, finding its options suddenly limited, made one committed sprint toward the fence and then surrendered. She caught it with both hands and tucked it under her arm alongside the first, 2 secured. Dian had cornered a third near the fence post. The fourth was still moving back and forth along the exterior of the coop with total dedication to its own alarm. He was straightening up with the third bird under his arm when he heard it. The sound is specific and unmistakable to anyone who has spent time around old trees in serious wind. A slow crack that begins deep in the wood and builds. And then very quickly, an explosive release of tension. The sound of something structural giving way all at once. He looked up at the sycamore. In the stormlight he could see the massive secondary limb, the one that extended northward over the yard, and it was moving in the wrong direction at the wrong speed. Arlene was standing directly beneath it. She hadn't looked up. She was watching the fourth bird. Dian moved, no clear memory of deciding. His body completed the decision before his mind had finished forming it. He crossed the ground in 3 strides and hit her from behind with his full weight, and they went down together hard into the mud and rolled, and half a second later the limb came down exactly where she had been standing. The impact drove into the earth and sent a vibration through the ground that he felt through his entire body. They lay in the mud in the rain, him half over her, her face turned sideways against the wet ground, both hands still somehow holding the bird pressed against her chest, which was objectively the least important priority available, and was also, he recognized, completely consistent with every piece of information he had gathered about her in 2 weeks. The rain poured over both of them. He was shaking. Not from the cold. His voice came out rough and louder than he intended. "Are you out of your mind? Do you understand what just happened? Do you understand what was directly over your head?" She turned her face to look at him. Rain on her face, mud at her hairline, eyes wide with the expression of someone who has just processed something a half second after it finished occurring. "I was getting the bird," she said, mildly stunned, mildly apologetic. Genuinely uncertain why this response was landing the way it was landing. The bird, he sat up, hands on her shoulders, the shaking visible and not something he was attempting to conceal. "Arlene." A limb the size of a small car came down on the exact ground you were standing on. "The bird could be replaced." "You cannot be replaced," she looked at him. Rain on both of them, mud on her coat, the bird still in her arms. She heard what he hadn't actually said out loud, the complete version of it, not just the anger, but the thing the anger was covering, which was not manageable and not something he could place back in any box he'd been keeping it in. "Dion." Her voice was barely audible under the rain. Lightning split the sky from north to south. He kissed her, not with any of the care he'd been applying to every interaction for 2 weeks. Not with the measured restraint of a man maintaining a careful distance and intending to maintain it considerably longer. This was what happens when fear and relief arrive at the same moment and burn through every layer of restraint on their way in. His hands on either side of her face in the mud, her mouth under his. The rain coming down on both of them with complete indifference to the situation. She kissed him back, not after a moment, immediately. As though she had been waiting for the thing that had been building in the kitchen and the garden and the mornings and the evenings to finally reach a place where it could be named, Her free hand came up and held on. The bird remained in the other arm, apparently committed to the situation regardless. The lightning came again closer. Dion lifted his head, rain in his eyes. We need to get inside. Right now, his voice sounded like someone else was using it. They ran. He hit the back door with his shoulder and forced it open against the wind. They came through together and he pulled it shut, and the storm dropped from overwhelming to merely loud. They stood in the mudroom, dripping onto the concrete. She set the bird in the laundry basket near the dryer. The bird arranged itself in the basket with the dignified indignation of a creature that has survived a significant event and requires a moment to reassemble its composure. Arlene stood in the middle of the mudroom floor, soaked through her jacket, teeth beginning to chatter. Didon got the thick wool blanket from the cabinet above the dryer and put it around her shoulders. Get out of the wet things. There are dry clothes in the chest in the front room. She looked at him, rain still on her face. The blanket around her shoulders. She didn't move toward the front room. He turned toward the wall and gave her the space. Heard the wet jacket hit the concrete floor. The mudroom was small and the storm was loud against the roof, and the quality of the air in that space was something he was deliberately not thinking about. A minute passed. Your turn. Her voice was steadier, a degree warmer than it had been. He pulled off his soaked shirt. When he turned around, he knew she was looking, not at the undamaged side, at all of it. The scar on the face she had touched in the garden, the scar on the shoulder, broader and rougher. The one that ran down the left side from the rib line, a landscape of skin that hadn't resembled itself since the night the tractor went wrong. 10 years of other people's eyes navigating around this. The reflex he'd built said, name it first. Deflect it with something small and self-deprecating. Move the conversation along before anyone else can move it for you. His voice came out before he caught it. Not much to look at, I know, she answered immediately. No preparation. None of the extra gentleness people extend when they are working toward a truth they want to cushion first. You're beautiful to me, quiet, without any ornamentation. Every part of you is exactly what you are. And what you are is a man who just threw himself into the mud to pull me out of the path of something that would have killed me. A pause. So I'm not going to apologize for looking. He turned fully toward her. She was wearing the old flannel shirt she'd found in the chest, oversized, falling nearly to her knees, wet hair over her shoulders, bare feet on the concrete floor, the blanket held in her hands now rather than wrapped around her, not closed. She was not looking anywhere else. He walked toward her slowly. Not from uncertainty, because he wanted her to have every foot of the distance to decide with. Arlene, his voice came out rough at every edge. What happened out there? That wasn't only the storm, she cut in. Her voice wasn't entirely steady, but it was absolutely clear. Then don't reduce it to something smaller than it was. He stood 2 feet from her in the mudroom with the storm working on the windows and the bird settled in its basket, and every careful structure he had built around himself across 8 years of being the only person on a property where nobody asked anything of him except that he keep it running. All of it felt very thin. I don't know the exact moment it started, he said. Maybe the afternoon you came. Maybe the first morning you stood in my kitchen. Maybe the minute you put your hand on my face without making any decision about what you were going to find there. He stopped. But when I thought I was about to watch you get hurt tonight, I understood something I had been choosing not to understand. She waited, present, completely still. I've fallen in love with my wife. The words came out plain and direct. No approach, no softening. Just the fact, finally stated in a place where it could be heard. The tears came to her eyes and mixed with the rain that was still on her face. I love you. Her voice broke around the edges. But the words themselves didn't. I think I started loving you the day you held a door open for me and didn't ask what I owed you for walking through it. And every day since then I've loved you more. Which was very much not part of the plan. She stopped. A sound that was partly a laugh and partly something less composed. That was very much not part of the plan. He reached out and placed his hand against her cheek. She leaned into it. Then no more separate rooms, he said. No more arrangement. If you want it, I want this marriage to be real in every sense. She looked up at him. I want it, she said. Simple. Certain the words of someone who has already done the deciding and is just saying so now. Outside, the storm threw itself against the farm with everything it had. Trees groaning under the load of it. Rain on the roof, like a sustained percussion. The distant crash of something in the yard that would require assessment in the morning light. Inside the old farmhouse. Two people who had each been alone for too long and careful for too long, who had arrived at each other through a dead man's love and a practical arrangement that had become something neither of them had planned for, stopped maintaining the distance between who they had been and what they were becoming. The morning after the storm carried the flat, washed light of a sky that has finished its business and moved on. Dion lay still in the grey morning, listened to Arlene breathing beside him, looked at the ceiling of a room that had been only his for 8 years and was now something else entirely. She turned, looked at him. The color in her cheeks was still there. She didn't look away. Good morning, quiet. Then after a beat, husband. The word landed differently than it had in the upstairs hallway the night of the ceremony. Without the uncertainty, without the sense of a test being conducted. This time it simply described what was true. He reached across and tucked a strand of still damp hair back from her face. Good morning, he said. The damage outside was real and required attention. Part of the barn roof had been lifted and displaced by the wind. 3 sections of fencing along the north paddock were down. The sycamore had lost 3 substantial limbs. The one that had nearly killed Arlene had left a crater in the ground and a new scar on the trunk the width of a man's forearm. 4 chickens had not survived the night, the ones that had gotten into the creek draw during the chaos of the storm before they'd caught the others. Arlene stood before the coop in the flat morning light, arms folded around herself. Looking at the vacant spaces, I'm sorry, she said quietly. If I hadn't gone out, if I hadn't insisted on getting that second bird, Dion came up behind her and put both hands on her shoulders. You saved 2 of them. More importantly, you are still standing here. Don't apologize for having a heart that cares about things. She leaned back against him without speaking. A kind of trust that doesn't require words and has its own weight. Roy Childs came to the house 2 days after the storm to check on the property the way he did after major weather. He assessed the barn roof and the fence sections and gave the practical verdict that both were repairable with a week's work. He helped move the displaced roofing material to the covered section of the other barn. He also noticed the way Arlene reached up, without thinking, to straighten Dion's collar when they came back across the yard to the porch, and the way Dion's hand found the small of her back as naturally as if it had found that position 100 times before. Roy looked at Dion with the expression of a man who recognizes when something has resolved itself correctly and understands that saying anything about it is unnecessary, which is precisely why what he said next hit harder than it otherwise would have. There's something you need to hear. He sat down in the porch chair, Earl's chair, the one Earl had sat in on his last visit. Constance has made her move official. She's filed a formal inquiry with the county questioning whether your marriage is legally valid, framing it as a marriage entered into under financial duress that represents a fraudulent claim on your property. He paused. She's also been in contact with the bank board. She holds enough stake in the institution to push for a formal review of your loan terms under the acceleration clause in your original loan agreement. If the board determines your financial circumstances have materially changed, they can call the full outstanding balance immediately. Dion already knew the number before Roy said it. He had known it for 7 years, $32,000, 3 weeks, possibly fewer depending on how aggressively she moves the board. Roy met his eyes directly. She has the relationships to move it fast. Arlene had gone very still beside Dion on the porch. She can actually trigger this, she said. Not a question. Working the mechanism out in real time, she has sufficient standing to apply the pressure, Roy said. Whether it survives legal challenge is a separate question. But the pressure itself is real and it's already moving. The porch held the silence for a moment. Dion looked out at the farm. The wheat, the barn, the vegetable beds Arlene had reorganized and expanded. Everything that represented 10 years of working a piece of ground back from the edge 3 weeks. Arlene looked at him, he looked back at her. We deal with it, he said. We find what a judge needs to see and we deal with it. That's all. She reached across and took his hand. The silver ring on her finger catching the flat post-storm light. Together, she said. Just the word that had become, without either of them scheduling it, simply accurate. The morning after Roy's visit, They sat at the kitchen table with the farm's financial folders spread between them and the coffee going cold while they looked at numbers Dion had been looking at for 7 years. $32,000. The original loan had been taken out when he purchased the property from his father's estate. He had paid it down steadily. 4 years from a clean payoff under circumstances that had existed before Roy sat down in Earl Reed's chair on his porch. Normal circumstances had developed an expiration date. Arlene looked at the paperwork with the focused expression of someone doing arithmetic they don't love the result of. The market income from the next 3 weeks won't cover it. No, the online orders are growing, but not at the pace we'd need. No, is there anything you could liquidate? The equipment is all working stock. Sell the tractor and I can't farm. Same for the other machinery. The cows contribute meaningfully to the monthly income. Selling them solves one number by creating 3 others. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the folder. Then we need to address the legal challenge before anything else. If we can get the marriage inquiry dismissed, the bank pressure loses the foundation it's standing on. Constance's ability to influence the loan board depends on the claim that the marriage is fraudulent. If that claim fails in front of a judge, her leverage over the bank fails with it. She had arrived at the correct analysis before he had. Roy knows a lawyer in Caldwell, Dion said. Daniel Okafor. He handled a property boundary dispute for the Henderson family 2 years ago and won it cleanly. Set up the meeting. They met with Daniel Okafor the following morning in his office above the hardware store on the square. Mid-40s. Methodical. He listened to all of it without interruption. The circumstances of the marriage, the timeline, the courthouse ceremony, Constance's inquiry with the county, the bank pressure, the specific language of the acceleration clause in the loan agreement. He asked questions for nearly 40 minutes. Then he set his pen down. The marriage inquiry is the more manageable piece. Pastor Odom was present at the market and witnessed the public confrontation directly. Roy Childs and Tamara Booker both witnessed the ceremony. Multiple community members can testify from their own observation that this relationship developed visibly and without any indication of coercion. Constance's claim is going to struggle against direct testimony from credible witnesses. He tapped his pen on the folder. The bank question is more complicated. The acceleration clause gives the board technical standing to review your loan. What we need is something that unchallenges Constance's standing to influence the board's decision in the first place. Something that shifts the ground under her. How do we establish that? Dion said. If she's done this before, used financial positioning to acquire property from people who were vulnerable, there may be a record of it. County Clerk's Office, Property Transaction Archives, recorded complaints. Something that reframes the conversation from defending your situation to exposing hers. Tamara called that evening and offered her cousin, who worked in the county records division, as an unofficial set of eyes on the public archive, not in any formal capacity. Just someone willing to look at what was accessible to anyone with patience and a reason to look. 3 days passed. Tamara's cousin found fragments. Property transactions with timelines that were unusual but not individually conclusive. A recorded complaint that had been filed and appeared to have gone no further. Pieces of a picture that raised questions without yet providing answers that could stand in front of a judge. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, 11 days after Roy had delivered his news on the porch, Dion woke at 2 a.m. to the thin line of light under the bedroom door. He waited a moment, then another. He got up. Arlene was at the kitchen table. Laptop open. A folder of photocopied documents spread across the surface in the arrangement of someone who had been reorganizing them for hours. A notepad beside her with columns of dates in her handwriting. Her coffee was cold and had been cold for a long time. She didn't look up when he came in. "You should be sleeping," she said. "So should you." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What are you working on?" "The Grimes transaction." She pointed to a document on the left side of the spread. Constance purchased a parcel of land from Arthur Grimes 3 years ago. 22 acres on the county's western edge. The sale price was below market, but not dramatically. Low enough to look like a friendly arrangement, not low enough to look like obvious theft. She moved her finger to the notepad. "But look at this date." Dion leaned forward over the table. The sale had closed on a Tuesday in March, 3 years prior. The date on the deed was unambiguous. "Now look at this." She slid a second document across. a photocopy of a hospital admission record, the administrative header, which becomes public record when submitted as part of a county dispute filing. Arthur Grimes, admitted to Caldwell County Regional Medical Center. The admission date was the Thursday before the sale closed, 5 days before the deed was signed. The admission diagnosis category on the header reads acute neurological event, Arlene said. That is the clinical language used on public admission records for stroke. Dion looked at the two documents side by side. The Grimes family filed a complaint with the county 8 months after the sale, she continued, claiming the transaction occurred while Arthur was incapacitated and unable to give valid consent. The complaint is in the archive. Nobody acted on it, she sat back. If Arthur was admitted to the hospital on Thursday with a stroke severe enough to require inpatient care, and the land sale closed the following Tuesday, 5 days later, then the signature on that deed was obtained from a man who was not in a position to give legally valid consent. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside the window, the November night was dark and cold, and entirely indifferent to what was being assembled across the kitchen table. Dion looked at the two documents. Then at her. The family filed a complaint and nothing happened. Nothing happened because Constance has relationships within county administration that cause things to slow down or stop when she wants them to. But the complaint exists on the public record. The hospital admission date is on the public record, and the two dates do not reconcile with the legal requirement for competent consent at the time of signing. He looked at her across the documents and the cold coffee and the 2 in the morning kitchen. We need Arthur Grimes himself. The documents establish the timeline. But a judge is going to want testimony from someone who was there. He's at the Pines Rest facility on Route 9. 12 miles out, she checked her notepad, 78 years old. He had a second minor event about 18 months ago, but according to the family's complaint, he's been coherent and communicative throughout. The family simply didn't have the financial resources to push a lawsuit against someone with Constance's capacity to defend against it. I'll go with you in the morning. I'll go alone, she said. Immediate. Certain. He'll respond better to one person than two, and he'll respond better to someone with a connection to Earl. She held Dion's eyes steadily. His wife and my mother were in the same church auxiliary for 15 years. He knew my family before I was old enough to know his name. She was right about all of it. All right, he said. She nodded, added a line to her notepad. Go to sleep, she said. One of us needs to be functional in the morning. He got up and poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh pot and put a mug in front of her and sat back down across the table. She was already reading the next document. He looked at the woman across the table, at the documents she had found, at the hours she had put in while he slept, at the notepad with its columns of dates that might, if they were careful enough, be enough. He thought about Earl Reed sitting in the chair under the sycamore, already failing, voice still deliberate. Look after the girl. Even if she won't let you. He looked at the woman across the table. She was looking after all of them. The Pines Rest facility sat on the eastern edge of Route 9, 12 miles outside Caldwell proper. Arlene drove out alone the following morning while Dion stayed at the farm. He fixed the north fence sections the storm had brought down. Started on the barn roof assessment. Found himself checking the end of the driveway more often than the fence work required. She was gone for just under 2 hours. When she came back, she pulled the truck up to the house and sat in it for a moment before getting out. He gave her the minute she seemed to need. Then she came in through the back door and sat down at the table, placed both hands flat on the surface. Looked at them. He remembers, she said. He remembers all of it clearly. Arthur Grimes had been sitting by his window when Arlene arrived, 78 years old. The years and the second event had made him physically smaller. But when she said her name, when she said whose daughter she was, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said Earl Reed was a good man, and that the world consistently produced fewer of them than it needed. Then she asked him about the land transaction. He said it simply. No rehearsal in it. I was in the hospital. They came and told me it was documentation related to my existing property records. Benefit coordination. Something routine. I was on medication. My thinking wasn't clear. I signed what they put in front of me. His voice, as Arlene described it, was measured and tired. Not confused. The voice of a man who had understood for 3 years that something wrong had been done to him and had not found anyone willing to hear it until now. My daughter filed a complaint with the county. Nothing came of it. We didn't have the money to take on someone with Mrs. Veal's legal resources. Arlene had told him what was at stake. What the documents showed when placed side by side. What a judge would need to hear from him specifically. He had said it without hesitation. If Earl Reed's daughter is asking me to stand up in front of a judge and say what I know happened, then I'll do it. Earl would have done the same for anyone who needed it. Dion reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. "We have him," he said. "We have him." Then quieter, after a moment, "We have my father still, just in a different form than before." They called Daniel Okafor that afternoon and told him. He was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he said they had a hearing to prepare for. That evening, Dion was in the barn doing a final check on the repaired roof sections when his phone buzzed with a message from Roy. 4 words, "She knows about Grimes." He stood in the barn for a moment, read the message again. Then he understood. Constance had sources inside county administration. The moment the Grimes complaint records had been accessed, someone had told her. She knew they had found the documents. She knew Arthur Grimes was willing to testify. And she was out of time, which meant she was out of options, which meant she was going to do something tonight. He was moving before he had fully thought it through. He came out of the barn and scanned the yard. The house lights were on. The sycamore was dark against the sky. The wheat field beyond it was darker still. Nothing moving in the yard. Then he saw it, a shadow at the far corner of the barn wall, then another, then a third, moving low and deliberate along the exterior wall with the specific intention of someone executing a plan they had worked out in advance. The smell reached him a moment later. Sharp. Chemical. Completely unambiguous. Gasoline. He was back at the house in 30 seconds. Through the mudroom door. Up the stairs, Arlene. She was already sitting up. Something in his voice had done it. 3 people in the yard. Near the barn wall. She was out of bed and moving. "Stay here," he said. "No," the word came out final. Without room for negotiation, we established that we go together. That hasn't changed. They went down the stairs in the dark without turning on any lights. Through the mudroom. He had the length of steel pipe he kept beside the back door. She had the heavy flashlight from the mudroom shelf, held dark, gripped as a weapon rather than a light source. They came around the east corner of the barn, 3 men. 2 crouched near the base of the far wall, working at something not yet fully visible. The 3rd standing watch. Back to them, the smell was stronger here. No ambiguity about what it was. The standing man heard them first. He turned. Kendrick Pruitt, day laborer. Dion had seen him at the market and the feed store for years. More than that, 5 years ago, a hard winter, a man with a broken-down truck and nowhere to go. Dion had let him sleep in the barn for 6 weeks, fed him, lent him money for repairs without making anything of it. Kendrick's voice came out strangled. "Dion, listen, this isn't," she said. "Nobody gets hurt. Just the structure, just the structure. The barn that contained everything required to get the farm through the winter. The equipment without which there would be no spring crop. No income, no means of paying the $32,000 already bearing down on them. And now the one piece of leverage that could stop Constance entirely. The credibility of the people prepared to testify against her. Destroyed if the farm burned and Dion had nothing left to fight with. Constance hadn't sent Kendrick here because she was desperate. She had sent him here because she had learned about Arthur Grimes and decided the farm needed to be gone before the hearing date. Arlene stepped up beside Dion. Her voice came out clear and cold in the dark. "You are going to burn down everything we have built. Because Constance Veal told you to, not a question. A fact stated plainly, so he had to hear it named." Kendrick opened his mouth. Headlights came up the driveway. Not one set, 3. The vehicles turned in and the beam swept across the yard and caught all 5 of them in the flat, exposing light that removes all ambiguity from whatever it illuminates. Roy Childs stepped out of the first truck. Behind him came 3 neighbors. Kevin Moore from the property half a mile south, Terry Okafor from the Ridge Road, and a 4th man Dion knew from the market who raised goats on 20 acres east of town. Roy had seen the same message Dion had received, had driven out without calling first, had called the others on the way. Roy's voice came out winter dry. "Kendrick, I've known your family 30 years. He looked at the 2 men by the barn wall without recognition. "Don't know these 2. But I know what I'm looking at." His eyes went to the cans on the ground. The smell that had reached him from the driveway. Every detail of tonight is going to be known across this county before the week is out. The two men by the wall made their decision fast. They went over the fence in the dark. Sound of footsteps moving through the field. Then, nothing. Kendrick didn't run. He stood in the headlights with his hands at his sides and looked at Dion with the face of someone who has exhausted every available narrative and is now standing in the plain space where the only remaining option is the truth. "She told me you were going to lose the farm regardless," he said. "Said the bank was already going to call the loan. Said this would just accelerate what was already coming and I'd be clear of what I owe her." He stopped. "I needed to be clear. How much?" Roy said. Kendrick's jaw tightened. 7,000. 3 years back. She called it in last week. Said if I did this she'd consider us settled. $7,000. The barn that held everything needed to make it to spring. Traded for $7,000 and a debt owed to a woman who had just learned her legal strategy was falling apart and had decided to try something else. Dion looked at him for a long moment. "You are going to tell the sheriff everything she said to you. Every conversation, every instruction. Everything she told you about our situation and what she wanted to happen." Kendrick's mouth opened. "If I do that, she's going to." Kendrick? Just his name. The pause after it carrying what it needed to carry. "You were standing next to an accelerant at 2 in the morning. The only way through this goes through the truth. You already know that. You knew it the moment those headlights hit you." He did know it. The calculation had completed itself the second Roy's truck turned into the driveway. Roy made the call to the sheriff's department from the driveway. Kevin Moore and Terry Okafor and the man with the goats stayed where they were, because people stay when it matters. The sheriff arrived in 20 minutes. Kendrick Pruitt talked for 2 hours. When the last vehicle left and the yard went quiet again, Dion stood on the porch and looked out at the farm. The barn was still standing. The wheat was still in the field. The documents were still on the kitchen table. Arthur Grimes was still at Pine's Rest on Route 9, and he was still willing to testify. Constance had played her last card, and the barn was still standing. Arlene came and stood beside him, arms crossed against the November chill. 2 days, she said quietly. 2 days, he said. Neither of them said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else to say. 2 days until the hearing. Either it went the way Daniel Okafor needed it to go, or it didn't. What Dion knew standing there in the dark was this: win or lose, farm or no farm. He was not the same man who had watched a woman walk up his porch steps 6 weeks ago and believed nothing was ever coming. Everything had changed, everything. They spent the day before the hearing working on 2 tracks simultaneously. Daniel Okafor prepared the legal presentation, the documentary evidence, the witness list, the sequence of argument. He called twice with updates and spoke in the flat, efficient language of someone who has learned that false hope is more damaging than difficult truth. He was not a man who promised outcomes. He was a man who prepared for them. Dion and Arlene dealt with the farm. The barn roof got the last of its temporary waterproofing. The replacement fence posts went in solid. The market orders for that week went out on time because Arlene packed them herself and left them labeled and stacked in the mudroom before she went to bed. Life continued, because life continues regardless of what else is happening. And you keep the farm running or you lose the farm. They understood this without saying it. The night before the hearing, Dion lay in the dark and ran the morning sequence forward in his mind for the 3rd time. What Daniel would argue, what Constance's lawyers would counter with, what Arthur Grimes would say from his wheelchair in front of a judge, and how much weight that testimony would carry. Fair odds. Not good odds. Fair. Arlene turned beside him. Are you still awake? If we lose tomorrow, she started. We deal with it, he said. Whatever it is, we deal with it. I was going to say, she stopped. Then started again quieter. If we lose tomorrow, I don't want you to think any of this was a mistake. Coming here. Stay any of it. He turned his head to look at her in the dark. Arlene, what? The only version of the last 6 weeks I would call a mistake is the one where you turned around at the bottom of the porch steps and walked back to town. She was quiet for a moment, then into the dark. Good night, Dion. Good night. A pause. Shorter than the ones that used to precede the word husband, she said. Not like a test anymore. Not like something being weighed for the first time. Just accurate. Just true. The word that described what was real. He reached across and found her hand in the dark and held it. Neither of them fell asleep quickly. Neither of them minded. They spent the 2 days before the hearing working on 2 tracks simultaneously. Daniel Okafor prepared the legal presentation, the documentary evidence, the witness list, the sequence of argument. He called twice a day with updates and spoke in the flat, efficient language of someone who has learned that false hope is more damaging than difficult truth. He was not a man who promised outcomes. He was a man who prepared for them. Dion and Arlene dealt with the farm. The barn roof got the last of its temporary waterproofing, enough to hold through winter if they needed it to. The replacement fence posts along the north paddock went in solid. The market orders for that week went out on time, because Arlene packed them herself the evening before and left them labeled and stacked in the mudroom before she went to bed. Life continued, because life continues regardless of what else is happening, and you keep the farm running or you lose the farm. They understood this without saying it. The night before the hearing, Dion lay in the dark and ran the morning sequence forward in his mind for the 3rd time. What Daniel would argue. What Constance's lawyers would counter with. What Arthur Grimes would say from his wheelchair in front of a judge. And how much weight that testimony would carry against the documented legal record that Constance's team would present alongside their own version of events. Fair odds, not good odds. Fair? Arlene turned Are you still awake? A pause. If we lose tomorrow, she started. We'd deal with it, he said. Whatever it is, we deal with it. I was going to say, she stopped. Then started again, quieter. If we lose tomorrow, I don't want you to think any of this was a mistake. Coming here, staying, any of it. He turned his head to look at her, in the dark. Arlene, what? The only version of the last 6 weeks I would call a mistake is the one where you turned around at the bottom of the porch steps and walked back to town. She was quiet for a moment. Good night, Dion, good night, a pause. Shorter than the ones that used to precede the word husband, she said. Not like a test anymore. Not like something being weighed for the first time. Just accurate, just true. The word that described what was real. He reached across and found her hand in the dark and held it. Neither of them fell asleep quickly. Neither of them minded. The county courthouse in Caldwell conducted public hearings in the main courtroom on the 2nd floor. Wood-paneled walls. Fluorescent lighting updated sometime in the 90s. Bench seating designed for function rather than comfort. The kind of room that communicates the business conducted here is serious, and attendance is not recreational. On an ordinary Thursday morning, it processed traffic matters and property line disputes and the routine administrative work of a small county government. The morning of the hearing, every bench was full. Dion had not anticipated that. He didn't know why he hadn't. The town had been watching this situation develop across 3 weeks. Small towns attend the things that matter to them. But he was not prepared for the faces when they walked in, neighbors whose names he knew and neighbors he recognized only by sight. The woman who sold preserves at the Saturday market. Kevin Moore in the 3rd row, arms crossed, expression already settled. Pastor Jerome Odom in the 2nd row wearing his collar, which was not what he wore on ordinary Thursdays. Roy Childs sat in the front row with the expression of a man who has waited in many rooms for many things to go right and is prepared to wait as long as the present situation requires. Tamra was near the aisle. She reached out as they passed and caught Arlene's hand, squeezed it once, hard and brief, and let go. Constance Veal sat across the aisle with 2 lawyers whose hourly rate exceeded Dion's weekly market income. She was dressed the way she always dressed. A performance of financial ease so habitual she probably no longer noticed she was performing it. But her hands folded on the table in front of her were not entirely still. Arthur Grimes arrived in a wheelchair pushed by an attendant from Pine's Rest. The years had made him physically smaller, but when he looked up at the room, his eyes were clear and fully present. He found Arlene's face in the gallery and gave her a small nod. I am here, I told you I would be. Here I am. Judge Calvin Moss entered at 9 o'clock precisely, 60-something. Deliberate in the manner of someone who has presided over enough proceedings to understand that truth announces itself given sufficient room, and that impatience rarely improves the process. He arranged his notes and looked at both tables. We are here on 2 connected matters. The first is the inquiry filed by Mrs. Constance Veal regarding the validity of the marriage between Dion Harper and Arlene Reed Harper. The second is a counterclaim concerning a property transaction between Mrs. Veal and Mr. Arthur Grimes. and the use of that transaction as a financial instrument to apply pressure to loan terms held by Mr. Harper at Caldwell County Community Bank. He looked up from his notes. "We will address the marriage question first." Constance's lead attorney was polished and methodical in the way of someone who has argued difficult facts before and has developed a reliable technique for doing so. He emphasized the speed of the arrangement, the financial extremity of Arlene's circumstances at the time of the marriage, the explicitly transactional language of the initial proposal. He used the word convenience 4 times in 10 minutes with the precision of someone who has selected it carefully and intends to get full value from it. He was genuinely skilled. You could see it in the way he structured each sentence and let the pauses carry weight, and looked at the judge at the moments he wanted the judge to look back. Daniel Okafor called Pastor Jerome Odom first. Pastor Odom described the Saturday market confrontation in precise detail. He had been there and witnessed it from close range. He described watching Arlene take Dion's hand in front of the assembled crowd, without any prompting or signal, at a moment when she had every reason to retreat instead. A public, voluntary declaration from a woman who had nothing to gain from it and everything to lose. He spoke about observing the relationship develop publicly across the weeks following the ceremony, with the authority of someone who has spent decades watching human behavior in small communities and has learned to recognize the difference between something constructed for an audience and something that simply is. "What I observed between these two people was not a transaction being maintained," he said. "It was two people in the process of learning to trust each other. That process is not comfortable. It does not move quickly. It does not resemble a performance. Because it is the exact opposite of one." Constance's attorney cross-examined him for 12 minutes and came away with nothing of use. Roy Childs described the ceremony. The weight of the moment when Dion produced his mother's ring. The way the two of them stood in that small office and took something seriously that they could have treated as administrative. Tamra Booker described Arlene's state of mind in the weeks preceding the marriage. Her genuine uncertainty, her fear. The words she had said in the courthouse hallway when Tamra had asked whether she was certain. "I don't know how this ends, but he doesn't look at me like I'm a problem to be managed." Those were not the words of a woman executing a financial strategy. Those were the words of a woman stepping into something genuinely uncertain because she had decided the uncertainty was worth accepting. Then Daniel called Dion. He described Earl Reed's visit, the green truck in the driveway, the chair under the sycamore. The exact words Earl had said, held in his memory for 8 months with the precision of something not consciously memorized, but simply lived with long enough to become completely present. He described what had happened between the ceremony and today, not romantically, not constructed for sympathy. The facts arranged in their actual sequence, the work done together, the conversations at the kitchen table, the vegetable beds, the storm. The choices each of them had made across the weeks of learning to inhabit the same space. When Constance's attorney rose to cross-examine, he asked whether Dion had entered the marriage primarily for the practical labor benefit. Dion looked at him. "I entered the marriage because Earl Reed asked me to look after his daughter, and because Arlene needed somewhere safe, and I needed help running a farm I couldn't manage alone. Those were the reasons at the beginning." A pause. "The reasons at the beginning are not the same as the reasons now. That is not a contradiction. That is what happens when two people spend time together honestly and pay attention to what they find." He did not have a follow-up question. Judge Moss looked at his notes. Then at Constance's table, "On the matter of marital validity, I have heard sufficient testimony to rule on this question before proceeding." He set his pen down. "The inquiry filed by Mrs. Veal fails to meet the evidentiary standard required to invalidate a legal marriage. Multiple credible witnesses have testified to the voluntary and good faith nature of the proceedings. The subsequent development of the relationship between the parties has been documented through direct community observation by individuals with no stake in the outcome. There is no credible evidence of coercion or fraud in either the formation or the continuation of this marriage." His voice held the same tone throughout. But something in the courtroom shifted when he reached the next sentence. "The marriage between Dion Harper and Arlene Reed Harper is valid and binding in the eyes of this court." Arlene exhaled beside him, not dramatic, Just the release of something that had been suspended for a very long time. The breath leaving a body that has been holding it for 3 weeks. Specific, quiet. Real Tamra made a sound from 3 rows back that she converted into a cough. Roy, in the front row, unfolded his arms. Judge Moss was already moving to the second matter. The property transaction between Mrs. Constance Veal and Mr. Arthur Grimes. Mr. Grimes, I understand you wish to address this court directly. Arthur Grimes had been waiting with the patience of a man who has been waiting for 3 years and has now arrived at the moment where the waiting ends. The attendant moved his wheelchair slightly forward to improve the acoustics. He spoke clearly. He had been in the hospital 5 days after his admission for the stroke. The medication had softened the edges of his thinking in ways he had been aware of, but unable to fully correct for. A woman he recognized from county administrative circles had come with 2 other individuals and presented him with documents described as benefit coordination paperwork related to his existing property records, streamlining his estate filing. Something routine. He had been unclear. He had signed where they directed him to sign. They had left. He had not understood what he had signed until his daughter found the deed transfer in his property records. 8 weeks later, I did not sell that land willingly, he said. I had plans for it. My son intended to build on it. It was not available for sale, and I did not knowingly sell it. The evenness in his voice was the evenness of a man who has done his grieving about this, and arrived at the place beyond grieving where only the accounting remains. What was done to me in that hospital was a deception carried out against a man who was not capable of protecting himself from it. And the people in that room were aware of that when they walked in. Constance's attorneys objected 3 times during his statement. Judge Moss sustained none of the objections. Daniel then presented the documents Arlene had assembled at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. The hospital admission record, the deed transfer date, the 5-day gap between them, the county complaint filed by Arthur's daughter and left unresolved in the public archive. The gap could not be reconciled with the legal requirement for competent consent at the time of execution. The courtroom was very quiet. Constance's lead attorney delivered his counter-argument with the controlled efficiency of a skilled professional working with bad facts. He emphasized procedural ambiguity, questioned the reliability of an elderly man's memory of events 3 years prior, suggested alternative interpretations of the timeline that were technically possible and practically implausible. He was good at his job. He was not good enough for what he was working with. Judge Moss heard the argument fully, made notes, asked 2 clarifying questions of Daniel, who answered them with precision. Then he looked directly at Constance Veal for the first time that morning. The frank gaze of a man who has formed his conclusion and is about to announce it. And then Constance Veal stood up. She did not consult her attorneys first, did not look at them. She stood with both hands on the table, and everything she had held in careful control across the morning simply came apart. This is because of Earl Reed. Her voice came out compressed. The sound of something that has been under pressure for a very long time finally finding a release point. Earl Reed stood in front of this community 20 years ago and publicly refused to cooperate with my father's business proposal. Stood in front of people at the county planning meeting and called my father's land acquisition plan predatory. He used that word, in public, and this county celebrated him for it. She was breathing harder now, the control she had maintained all morning nowhere visible. My father was not a predatory man. He was a businessman who made hard decisions, and Earl Reed humiliated him at a moment when our family could not afford to be humiliated. We lost 3 contracts that year. Lost standing we never fully recovered, and I watched this community reward Earl Reed for 2 decades while my family dealt with the consequences. Her voice dropped but didn't soften. He was wrong. He was self-righteous and wrong. And this man sitting in this courtroom got to keep farming his land because Earl Reed decided to make a public stand at my family's expense. The room had gone to a quality of stillness that is different from ordinary quiet. The stillness of 60 people simultaneously understanding something they had not fully understood before. Pastor Jerome Odom stood up from the second row. He did not raise his voice, he had no need to. Earl Reed is gone, Constance. He spoke to her with the even tone of someone who has sat with people at the worst moments of their lives long enough to understand that anger is almost never the primary thing. It is the thing that sits on top of the primary thing. He has been gone for 8 months. He cannot hear what you're saying. He cannot answer it. And he cannot reach back 20 years and repair what happened. Because whatever happened 20 years ago is past the range of repair. A pause. The person who has spent 2 decades ensuring this community kept paying for something that hurt your family. That person is not Earl Reed. That person is you. And you are the one who will have to live with what that choice has cost. Constance looked at him, then she looked at the room. At 15 years' worth of faces she had cultivated and leveraged and categorized according to their usefulness to her at any given moment. At Roy Childs in the front row, at Arthur Grimes in his wheelchair, at Arlene sitting beside Dion with her hands in her lap and her spine straight. Her expression held something Dion recognized, not anger, not defiance, grief. The grief of a woman who had spent 20 years directing pain at everyone within reach and had never once hit what she was actually aiming at. Because what she was aiming at had been gone the whole time. Earl Reed had been dead for 8 months. The version of Earl Reed she had been fighting had been dead for 20 years. The moment the planning meeting ended and the county went home and her family was left with the aftermath. You cannot win an argument with someone who is no longer present to hear it. And 20 years of trying had not changed that fact. Constance Veal sat back down. She said nothing else. Judge Moss allowed a moment. Deliberate and respectful, as though he understood that something had just occurred that warranted acknowledgement before the business of the proceeding moved to its conclusion. Then he picked up his pen. On the matter of the property transaction between Mrs. Veal and Mr. Arthur Grimes. This court finds credible and compelling evidence of a transfer executed under circumstances that rendered valid legal consent impossible. The deed transfer is voided. The property reverts to Mr. Grimes and his estate. A pause. Furthermore, the collateral instrument derived from that transaction and used to apply pressure to the loan review process at Caldwell County Community Bank is found to have been based on a fraudulently obtained asset. The review of Mr. Harper's loan terms initiated under that pressure is dismissed in its entirety. The existing loan terms are reinstated in full. The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was something more human than that. The collective exhale of 60 people releasing something that had been held suspended for too long. The sound of weight redistributing itself across a community that had been watching something out of balance and is now watching it correct. Then someone in the middle of the benches started clapping. Not Tamra, not Roy. Someone Dion couldn't immediately identify, just a person who had decided the moment called for it. Someone beside them joined. And then the sound built the way sound builds in rooms when people have been holding it in for a long time. Constance Veal stood without looking at anyone and walked out of the courtroom. Her attorneys gathered their materials with the efficient speed of men who bill by the hour and have reached the end of the billable work. The door at the back opened and closed. Tamra came around and pulled Arlene in. They stood together in the aisle, and Tamra was crying openly, and Arlene was holding on with the grip of someone who has been bracing against something for 3 weeks, and is finally, for the first time, allowing herself to stop. Roy put his hand on Dion's shoulder and left it there. He was quiet for a long moment. Roy was almost always quiet for a long moment. Then he said what he had come to the courthouse to say, whether the verdict had gone this way or the other. Your father would have been proud of what you've built here. Earl would have been too. Dion looked at the front of the courtroom. At the empty space where Arthur Grimes's wheelchair had been. They were already moving him toward the door. At the judge's bench where Calvin Moss was closing his folders with the unhurried calm of a man who considers this a good day's work and is right to consider it that. At the benches emptying around him. Faces he had been living in the same small geography with for years, without always knowing what they were to each other, until a morning like this one clarified it. He thought about Earl Reed sitting in the chair under the sycamore, his body already failing and his voice still deliberate, making a request of a man he trusted because there was no one else he trusted enough to make it to. He thought about what it means to leave something behind that is not property and not money and cannot be recorded anywhere. The kind of legacy that lives in the space between people who treated each other with enough decency across enough years that the accumulated credit is still moving through the world after the person who generated it is no longer present to see it. Earl Reed had been gone for 8 months. He had been present in this courtroom every minute of the morning. The gathering that evening assembled itself the way the best things in small communities assemble, without a designated organizer, without a formal invitation, without anyone specifically being in charge of the result. Someone set up folding tables on the square. Someone brought enough food for more people than had been expected. A man with a guitar appeared and proved capable enough that people wanted to remain within range of him. The November string lights that Caldwell installed each year for the season were already up along the storefronts, strung between wooden posts in the warm amber light that makes an ordinary street look like somewhere worth occupying. People move through the evening in the way people move through gatherings that have been earned rather than scheduled. Some came to say things they had needed to say for a while. The woman from the preserves table found Arlene near the edge of the square and said something too quiet for Dion to catch from where he stood. Arlene listened and nodded and didn't make it more complicated than it needed to be. A man from the hardware store who had stopped purchasing Dion's specialty rosemary 18 months ago, under the kind of ambient pressure that Constance applied to local commerce, found him at the food table. Said he'd like to resume if Dion was amenable. Dion said he was amenable. Small corrections. The kind that don't make any official record and don't resolve everything and matter enormously anyway. Roy ate 2 full plates of a casserole someone had brought and declared it the best development of a week that had contained several significant developments, which, given everything that had happened in the preceding 3 weeks, was saying something considerable. Arthur Grimes's daughter had driven over from the next county when she heard the outcome. She received the news of the judgment with the specific relief of someone who has been right about something for 3 years and has now been told so by a person with the authority to make it official. Tamra found her near the edge of the crowd, and they stood together for a long time, talking in the way of 2 women whose families had been wronged by the same machinery and were only now beginning to name it out loud. The guitar player found the tempo for something slow, and the couples on the square moved into it, and the gathering became for an hour exactly what a community is meant to be when it is doing the actual work of being one. Dion and Arlene danced under the lights between the wooden posts. She had her head against his shoulder, his hand was at her back. The music was unhurried, and the November air was cold enough that being close to another person was both practical and everything else it was. He leaned down and spoke near her ear. "Do you remember what you said on my porch that first evening in October?" She lifted her head slightly. "I said several things on your porch that evening. You said your father told you I needed a wife, and you said he was right. One more measure of the music. The lights above them in the cold air. I was wrong," he said. She lifted her head fully and looked at him. The string lights caught her face. Her expression held the uncertainty that almost never appeared there anymore, the one that meant she was genuinely unsure of what was coming next. "I didn't need a wife," he said. "I needed you, specifically and exactly you. Your hands in my garden and your voice in my kitchen and your mind at 2 in the morning with a folder of documents that saved everything I had spent 10 years building." He held her eyes. "Your father wasn't right about what I needed in general, a beat. He was right about you." She looked at him for a long moment. The music continued. The lights held. The square moved around them with all the ordinary business of a community putting itself carefully back together. Then her eyes filled, which she allowed without doing anything to stop it. "I love you, Dion Harper," she said. "Every scar and every silence and every burned egg. Technically, I have only burned 2 eggs total. More than 2. The evidence on several of those is disputed," she laughed. "The real kind, full and unguarded. The kind that had started appearing in his kitchen in the mornings and had at some point, without his being able to identify exactly when, become something he organized the days around the possibility of hearing." He pulled her closer and they finished the song under the November lights, and the community moved around them, and for the first time in 8 years the North Farm had someone to come home to. The winter that followed was the first one in 8 years, that the house didn't carry the feeling of waiting for something that wasn't coming. They paid the loan balance down steadily through January, using the market income combined with a wholesale contract for specialty herbs that Arlene had negotiated with a restaurant 40 miles away. Not a large contract, but consistent, which is worth more than large when you are building the foundation of something that needs to last. By February, the outstanding balance had dropped to a number that no longer felt like a threat. By March, it felt like an obligation they were working through together, the way you work through any shared commitment that has a defined endpoint. Daniel Okafor filed the formal documentation of Arthur Grimes's deed reversal with the county. The Grimes family had their land back. Arthur's son began the planning process for the building that had been deferred for 3 years. Arthur himself, according to his daughter when she called to tell them, was sleeping better. That was the phrase she used, sleeping better. As though the weight of an unresolved wrong is something a body carries even in the night, and justice, even delayed justice, is something the body can finally set down. The charges against Constance Veal for fraud in the Grimes transaction moved through a separate civil proceeding that her attorneys slowed considerably but could not stop. The Grimes family's case, backed now by the public record and Arthur's own testimony already on file from the hearing, was not something that could be buried a second time. By February, the county prosecutor's office had opened a parallel inquiry into 2 additional property transactions that bore similar signatures, timelines that didn't reconcile, complaints that had been filed and gone nowhere, sellers who had been at their most vulnerable when the paperwork appeared. Constance Veal did not appear at community events during the period the proceedings were active. She did not appear at the Saturday market. She did not appear at the county planning meetings she had attended with such regularity for 15 years. The county noticed her absence and drew its own conclusions, the way counties do, quietly, without announcement, and with the long memory that small communities apply to people who have spent years using their trust as a transaction. She had not been defeated by a single verdict. She had been made visible, and once a certain kind of person is made visible, once the pattern is named in a room full of people who can corroborate it, the architecture of influence that depended on nobody looking directly at it tends to come apart on its own. The charges related to the attempted barn burning moved through the county prosecutor's office with less complication. Kendrick Pruitt had cooperated fully, as Dion had told him at 2 a.m. that he would need to. The 2 men who had gone over the fence that night were identified through other means and faced their own accounting. None of it made the farm whole again in any measurable way, but it made the truth part of the public record, which is sometimes the most a person can ask for. Roy came for Sunday dinner every week through the winter without ever waiting for a formal invitation. Arrive reliably. Allow the hosts to determine over time whether they enjoy having you there. They did. He ate without reservation and talked about the farm the way a man talks about land he has been paying attention to for decades, with an exact mixture of criticism and affection that doesn't translate neatly into any single word. Tamra's various opinions about various subjects occupied Arlene at the kitchen table on several full evenings across the winter months. Dion learned considerably more about matters he had not expected to learn. He had no opinions about any of it, and the wisdom to keep that fact private. The spring arrived early. The ground thawed in the 3rd week of February, early even by the generous standards of Georgia winters, and they were in the vegetable beds by the 1st of March. The planting calendar Arlene had drafted over the winter and pinned to the kitchen wall was already adjusting in real time to account for the season's early opening. She had added 2 new beds along the south fence, expanded the herbs section substantially, added a row of specialty lettuces about which she had developed specific and increasingly detailed opinions that Dion found, entirely against his prior understanding of his own interests, genuinely compelling to listen to. The farm looked different than it had looked the previous October. Not so different as to be unrecognizable. Still his. Still the property his father had built on his grandfather's land. Still the place he had nearly lost and had been given the time to keep, but fuller, more inhabited. The way a room looks when someone who understands the arrangement of things has spent real time inside it. One afternoon in late March, he came in from the east fence line and found her in the garden. He stopped at the edge of the beds before she noticed him, just watched. She was doing the thing she did when she was fully absorbed in the work, a low, quiet murmuring directed at the plants. Not quite words, more like the sound of continuous attention. Her forearms were dirty past the elbow, her hair was back. The late March light came at the low, warm angle of a day getting longer. She registered him looking. She always registered it. She turned and looked over her shoulder. How does the east fence look? Like it was repaired by someone who knows what he's doing. Did you replace the latch on the second paddock gate? The one that's been loose since before the storm? Same one. Good. She turned back to the plant she was working with. There's coffee inside. He stood at the edge of the bed for another moment. The afternoon light, the new beds, the dirt on her forearms. The woman who had walked up his porch steps in October with nothing left and a message from her dead father and had become, somewhere across the months between then and now, the thing this farm had been missing since before he ever owned it. Arlene. She turned. Thank you, he said. For coming. For staying. For the 2 in the morning and Arthur Grimes and all of it. He looked at the beds she had built and the plants she had put in them. For this, she held his eyes for a moment. Don't thank me, she said. I'm exactly where I want to be. He went inside for the coffee. Left her in the garden with the late light and the new beds and the quiet sound of someone who has found the place where what they know how to do meets what the world actually needs. April came in warm. The garden was running ahead of schedule across all the beds. The market stall had developed a consistent Saturday line. The wholesale herb contract was renewed at increased volume. The spring planting was clean, and ahead of the calendar Arlene had pinned to the kitchen wall. One afternoon she was making her assessment walk through the tomato section. The same bed she had staked in her first week on the property, now full and actively growing in the early season warmth. Dion came up from the field. He saw her standing near the center of the row, not walking, not assessing, still one hand at her side, one hand resting lightly on her stomach, something in the posture. Not anything he could have named precisely. Just something that made him stop. Arlene. She turned. She had been crying. But not the crying of someone in pain, a different kind entirely. The kind that comes from feeling more than a single moment can comfortably contain. She walked toward him. Took his hand. Placed it over the place where hers had been resting. She held his hand there without speaking. Just held it, then, we're going to have a baby. The garden was around them, and the April light was coming at the low angle of late afternoon, and somewhere near the barn, one of the cows was making its opinion known, and the whole ordinary continuing world of the farm went on doing everything it always did. Without pausing to mark the fact that something in the middle of the tomato beds had just become irrevocably different. Dion stood completely still. Then he picked her up. He is not someone who picks people up as a general practice. But he lifted her off the ground and turned in the middle of the beds, and she laughed. The full surprised version of it, unguarded and complete. And that laugh went out across the yard and the field beyond it, and probably all the way to the red dirt road. He held her there in the turning and the light and the impossible, ordinary weight of a moment that had no adequate description. He set her down and held her face in both hands. I love you, he said. I love you, and I love all of this, and I love everything that this is. She was crying and laughing at the same time, which is a combination she managed with more grace than most people he had encountered. My father was more right than he understood when he said it, she said. He told you that you needed a wife. But what you needed was a family, Dion. What this whole place needed was a family. He looked at her, at the garden behind her, at the house behind that, at the field beyond the house, at the April sky above all of it, going the deep blue that Georgia produces when the season has fully committed to being what it is. That evening they sat under the sycamore. Dion had built a bench there over the winter. Good wood. Solid joinery. The kind of construction meant to outlast the person who made it. He had carved their initials into the back rail, D and A overlapping, and felt slightly foolish about it when he did it, and had not felt foolish about it at any point since. Arlene had her head against his shoulder. The April evening was cool, but not cold. The lights in the farmhouse windows made the place look like what it was, occupied, lived in, somewhere that had been actively chosen. She spoke into the darkening air. Thank you, Dad, soft, into the April dark, into the space between the sycamore and the wheat field, and the sky going deep blue above it all. You were right. Dion put his arm around her. She leaned into him. The wheat would go in next week. The garden was ahead of schedule. The baby would arrive in November. The farm's quietest season and the most significant event of their lives would come at the same time. Which seemed, on reflection, exactly right. You tend what you have. You trust the ground. You stay when it becomes difficult. And you pay attention to what comes up. A woman had stood on his porch in October, with a message from a man who had loved her enough to plan carefully for what would come after he was gone. And from nothing more than a father's faith in the right people, a daughter's courage in showing up anyway, and a farmer's willingness to say yes to something he didn't have nearly enough information to fully understand. He had been given back everything he had gradually stopped believing was still available to him: the farm, the work, the house with its sounds at night, and this, all of this, a weight against his side. The child they hadn't yet known about when the year began, the bench with their initials in the grain of the wood, the field going dark at the close of another day that had been, in every way that counted, enough. The North Farm held its April quiet, and inside it, two people who had each been alone for too long sat under the sycamore in the last of the light and listened to the season change.